Hey there friends, welcome back to Botanic Haven, your go-to channel for everything gardening, plant care and creating those beautiful green spaces both inside your home and out in your yard. I'm so glad you're here today because we're diving into something that honestly changed my entire approach to growing potatoes, and I can't wait to share it with you. If you've ever dreamed of pulling enormous restaurant-worthy potatoes from your own garden, the kind that make your neighbors stop and ask what on earth you're doing differently, then stick around. We're talking about giant potatoes here, folks, tubers that can reach up to 2 kilograms each, and I'm going to walk you through the exact method that makes it possible. This isn't some complicated agricultural science experiment, I promise. It's actually surprisingly simple once you understand the basic principles, and I've seen it work wonders not just in my own garden, but in the gardens of so many people I've helped over the years. Let me start by telling you a quick story. A few seasons back, my friend Daisy called me up, absolutely frustrated with her potato harvest. She'd been growing potatoes the same way for years, following the traditional method her grandmother taught her, and while she always got a decent crop, the potatoes were small, kind of underwhelming, nothing like the beauties you see at farmers' markets. She was ready to give up on potatoes altogether and just buy them from the store. I convinced her to try this method I'd been experimenting with, and let me tell you, when harvest time came around, she was sending me photos every other day. One of her potatoes weighed in at just over 1.8 kilograms. She couldn't believe it, and neither could I, even though I'd seen similar results in my own garden. That moment really drove home for me how much of a difference the right technique makes. It's not about having the perfect soil or the ideal climate, though those things help. It's about understanding what potato plants actually need to produce those monster tubers. So what's the secret? Well, it all comes down to giving your potato plants more room to grow underground, more nutrients to feed on, and a longer growing season to really develop those tubers. The traditional method of planting potatoes in rows and hilling them up a bit works fine for average-sized potatoes, but if you want giants, you need to think bigger. The method I'm going to share with you today is sometimes called the deep trench method, and it's based on the idea that potatoes form along the buried stem of the plant. The more stem you have underground, the more places potatoes can develop, and the more space and nutrients they have available, the bigger they can grow. It sounds simple because it is, but there are some specific steps you need to follow to really maximize your results. First things first, let's talk about timing and variety selection. Not all potato varieties are created equal when it comes to size potential. You want to choose varieties that are known for producing large tubers. Some of my favorites for this method are Russet Burbank, which are those classic baking potatoes, King Edward, which is a British heritage variety that performs beautifully, and Kennebec, which is incredibly versatile and grows large under the right conditions. I've also had great success with Yukon Gold, though they tend to be slightly smaller than the russets. The key is to look for varieties described as main crop or late-season potatoes, because these have a longer growing period which gives them more time to size up. Early varieties mature quickly, which is great if you want new potatoes in early summer, but they just don't have the time to reach giant proportions. When it comes to timing, you want to plant your potatoes after your last frost date, when the soil has warmed up to at least 10 degrees Celsius. Cold soil slows down growth and can lead to rotting, so patience here really pays off. I usually wait until I can comfortably work the soil without it clumping together, which in my area is typically mid to late April. If you're in a warmer climate, you might plant earlier, and if you're in a cooler region, you might need to wait until May. The important thing is that your potatoes have a long, warm growing season ahead of them. Remember, we're aiming for giants here, and that takes time. Now let's get into the actual planting method. This is where things differ significantly from traditional potato growing. Instead of digging shallow furrows, you're going to dig a trench that's about 30 to 40 centimeters deep and about 30 centimeters wide. I know that sounds like a lot of work, and I won't lie to you, it is a bit more labor intensive up front, but trust me when I say it's absolutely worth it. The depth is crucial because it gives you room to add layers of organic matter and compost as the plants grow, which both feeds the plants and encourages more stem growth underground. When I'm digging my trenches, I space them about 90 centimeters to 1 meter apart. This gives each plant plenty of room and makes it easier to work between the rows for watering, weeding, and later on, hilling up. Once you've got your trench dug, Don't just toss your seed potatoes in there. This is where we start building the foundation for those giant tubers. At the bottom of your trench, add about 5 to 8 centimeters of well-rotted compost or aged manure. I personally prefer a mixture of both because compost provides a wide range of nutrients and improves soil structure, while aged manure gives a nice nitrogen boost that potatoes love, especially in the early stages of growth. If you don't have access to manure, don't worry, good quality compost works perfectly well on its own. Just make sure whatever you're using is well rotted. Fresh manure can burn your plants, and nobody wants that. Mix this organic matter with the soil at the bottom of the trench, so it's not just sitting there in a layer. You want it integrated. If this guide has helped you, write 1 in the comments, and if not, write 0. This way, I'll know which tips are most useful for your garden. Alright, moving on to the seed potatoes themselves. You want to use certified seed potatoes rather than potatoes from the grocery store because seed potatoes are guaranteed to be disease-free and they're treated to promote sprouting. About 2 to 3 weeks before planting, I like to chit my seed potatoes, which just means letting them sprout in a cool, bright place. I put them in egg cartons or old wooden crates with the eyes facing up, and within a couple weeks they develop these stubby, strong sprouts. You want sprouts that are about 1 to 2 centimeters long, thick and healthy looking, not those long, pale, stringy things you sometimes see on potatoes that have been sitting in the cupboard too long. When it comes to the size of your seed potatoes, bigger is actually better for this method. While you can cut large seed potatoes into pieces for traditional planting, for growing giants I recommend using whole, large seed potatoes, ideally about the size of a tennis ball or even bigger. Each seed potato contains stored energy that fuels the initial growth of the plant, and a larger seed potato means more energy available. I've done side-by-side comparisons in my garden, planting cut pieces versus whole large seed potatoes, and the difference in final tuber size is noticeable. The plants from whole seed potatoes establish faster and produce larger potatoes overall. Place your seed potatoes in the trench about 45 to 60 centimeters apart. I know this seems like a lot of space, but remember, we're going for size, not quantity. These plants are going to develop extensive root systems and large above-ground foliage, and crowding them will only limit their potential. Once your seed potatoes are positioned, cover them with about 10 centimeters of that compost and soil mixture. Don't fill the trench all the way yet. We're going to do that gradually as the plants grow. Water everything in well, but not so much that you create a soggy mess. Potatoes need consistent moisture, but they hate waterlogged soil. Over the next few weeks, your potato plants will start poking through the soil. This is where the magic of this method really starts to happen. As the shoots grow and reach about 15 to 20 centimeters above the soil level in your trench, you're going to add another layer of compost-enriched soil, burying about 1/2 to 2/3 of the new growth. I know it might seem counterintuitive to bury your plants, but potatoes actually love this. Those buried stems will develop more roots and, more importantly, more spots where tubers can form. You're essentially training the plant to grow a longer underground stem system. My friend Oliver was skeptical about this whole burying the plants thing when I first told him about it. He kept saying it felt wrong, like he was smothering his potatoes. But I convinced him to try it with just one trench while growing his other potatoes the traditional way, and the difference was stark. The plants in the deep trench, the ones we kept hilling up and feeding, ended up producing potatoes that were easily double the size of his traditional crop. He's been a convert ever since. And now he actually looks forward to the hilling process because he knows each time he does it, he's setting the stage for bigger potatoes. You'll repeat this process of adding layers every couple of weeks until your trench is filled and you've created a nice mound above the original ground level. By the end of the growing season, you should have a raised bed about 20 to 30 centimeters above where you started. Each layer you add should include some compost or well-rotted organic matter. I typically use a mix that's about 70% soil and 30% compost for these layers. This keeps feeding the plants throughout the season without overwhelming them with too much nitrogen, which can lead to lots of leafy growth but smaller tubers. Watering is absolutely critical for growing giant potatoes. These plants are producing a lot of foliage and developing large tubers underground, both of which require consistent moisture. However, and this is important, consistent doesn't mean constant. You want the soil to be evenly moist but never waterlogged. I've found that a deep watering 2 to 3 times a week works better than frequent shallow watering. Deep watering encourages the roots to grow down, which makes for a healthier, more resilient plant. When the weather is particularly hot or if you're in a dry spell, you might need to water more often. A good way to check is to stick your finger into the soil near the plants. If the top 5 centimeters are dry, it's time to water. One thing I learned the hard way is that irregular watering can cause problems. If the soil goes from bone dry to soaking wet repeatedly, you can end up with issues like hollow heart or growth cracks in your potatoes. Rose, another gardening friend of mine, had this exact problem a few years ago. Her schedule was crazy busy and she'd forget to water for days, then feel guilty and absolutely drench the potato patch. Her harvest was disappointing, lots of cracked, oddly shaped tubers that didn't store well. Once she set up a simple drip irrigation system on a timer, her potato quality improved dramatically. You don't need fancy equipment though, just a consistent approach to watering. Fertilizing is another piece of the puzzle. While we're adding compost with each layer, which provides a slow release of nutrients, potatoes are heavy feeders and can benefit from additional fertilization. I like to use an organic fertilizer that's balanced but slightly higher in potassium and phosphorus than nitrogen. Too much nitrogen will give you beautiful, lush plants with disappointing tubers. Potassium is particularly important for tuber development and size. About 6 weeks after planting, I give my potatoes a side dressing of an organic fertilizer, working it gently into the soil around the plants. Then I repeat this about every 3 to 4 weeks until the plants start to flower. Once they flower, I stop fertilizing because at that point the plants are shifting their energy into tuber development, and you don't want to push more foliage growth. Some people swear by foliar feeding with seaweed extract or compost tea, and I've had good results with this as well. A light spray of diluted seaweed extract every couple of weeks can provide trace minerals and give the plants a little boost. Just make sure to spray early in the morning or in the evening to avoid leaf burn. I usually do this in the early evening, and I make sure to spray both the tops and bottoms of the leaves, since plants can absorb nutrients through their foliage. It's one of those little extras that might not be absolutely necessary, but in my experience, it contributes to overall plant health and vigor. Pest and disease management is something you can't ignore when you're investing this much effort into growing giant potatoes. Colorado potato beetles are probably the most common pest, and they can absolutely devastate a potato patch if left unchecked. I check my plants every few days, looking at the undersides of leaves for the bright orange egg clusters. When I find them, I just crush them or knock them into a bucket of soapy water. The adult beetles and their larvae are pretty easy to spot and handpick if you stay on top of it. I've tried various organic sprays over the years, and while some work okay, I find that vigilance and handpicking is really the most effective method for a home garden. Late blight is a disease that can strike potato plants, especially in cool, wet conditions. It's what caused the Irish potato famine, so you know it's serious. The first signs are dark spots on the leaves, often with a white mouldy growth on the underside. If you see this, act fast. Remove and destroy affected leaves, and improve air circulation around your plants. Some gardeners use copper-based fungicides preventatively, and that's certainly an option, but I prefer to focus on prevention through plant spacing, good air circulation, and avoiding overhead watering, which keeps the foliage wet. Lucas, a neighbour who grows potatoes in his community garden plot, lost almost his entire crop to late blight one particularly wet summer. He was heartbroken, but it taught him some valuable lessons about spacing and airflow. The next year, he gave his plants more room, made sure they had good air circulation, and kept an eye on the weather forecast so he could apply preventative treatments before wet periods. His crop bounced back beautifully, and he's been careful about these factors ever since. It's a reminder that sometimes our biggest learning moments come from our failures. As your plants grow through the season, you'll notice they get quite tall and bushy. This is a good sign. Healthy, vigorous foliage means the plants are photosynthesizing well and producing the energy needed to grow those big tubers underground. Around midsummer, your plants will flower. The flowers are actually quite pretty, and their appearance signals that tuber formation is in full swing. Some old gardening wisdom says you should pinch off the flowers to redirect energy to the tubers, but honestly, I've never noticed a significant difference when I've tried this. The energy required to produce a few flowers is minimal compared to the overall energy budget of the plant, so I usually just let them bloom and enjoy the sight. One question I get asked a lot is whether you can harvest a few early potatoes while leaving the plants to continue growing. Technically, yes, you can carefully dig around the edges and snag a few small potatoes without disturbing the plant too much. But for this giant potato method, I really recommend leaving everything alone until final harvest. Every time you dig around in there, you risk damaging roots and developing tubers. And remember, we're going for maximum size here. Patience is key. I know it's tempting, believe me, I've been there, but resist the urge and let those tubers reach their full potential. Knowing when to harvest is important. Your potatoes are ready when the plants start to die back naturally. The foliage will turn yellow and begin to wither, usually in late summer or early fall, depending on when you planted and what variety you're growing. Some people cut the foliage down once it starts to die back, letting the tubers sit in the ground for another 2 weeks to let the skins toughen up. This is called curing, and it helps the potatoes store better. I've tried both methods, harvesting right when the plants die and waiting 2 weeks after cutting them back, and I do think the waiting period makes for better storage. Harvest Day is honestly one of my favourite days in the gardening calendar. There's something incredibly satisfying about digging into that mound you've carefully built over months and pulling out massive potatoes. Use a garden fork rather than a spade to reduce the risk of cutting into the tubers and start digging at the outer edges of the mound, working your way in. Go slowly and carefully. When you hit your first giant potato, you'll understand why all this effort was worth it. I still get excited every single time, no matter how many seasons I've done this. Ivy, who lives a few streets over from me, tried this method last year for the first time after hearing me talk about it at a neighborhood gathering. She sent me a photo of her first harvested potato with a tape measure next to it, 28 centimeters long and weighing just over 1.6 kilograms. She was so proud, and rightfully so. She told me later that she'd been growing potatoes for years, but had always thought the small sizes were just how things were. Learning that there were better methods out there completely changed her perspective on what was possible in her garden. That's exactly why I love sharing these techniques. After harvesting, let your potatoes sit in a shaded, cool area for a few hours to dry off. Don't wash them yet, just brush off excess soil. Then move them to a dark, cool storage area with good ventilation. Ideal storage temperature is around 7 to 10 degrees Celsius with high humidity, but good airflow. A basement or root cellar works great, or even a cool garage if you don't have those options. Properly stored, these giant potatoes can last 4 months. I've had potatoes from an autumn harvest stay perfectly good until the following spring. Check them periodically and remove any that start to soften or sprout so they don't affect the others. Now I want to address some common questions and concerns that come up with this method. First, people worry about the amount of space required. Yes, this method does take more space per plant than traditional methods, but remember, you're getting significantly larger potatoes. In terms of total yield by weight, you often end up ahead even with fewer plants. If space is really tight, you could try this method with just a couple of plants to see how it works for you, and continue growing the rest of your potatoes traditionally. Even 1 or 2 giant potatoes can be a fun experiment and a learning experience. Second question I hear often is about cost. Won't all that compost and organic matter get expensive? It can if you're buying everything bagged from a garden centre, but there are ways around this. Start a compost pile if you haven't already. It's basically free fertiliser from your kitchen scraps and yard waste. Check with local farms or stables for aged manure. Many are happy to give it away or sell it cheaply. Some municipalities offer free or cheap compost made from yard waste collected in the community. With a little resourcefulness, you can keep costs very reasonable. Third, what if your soil is heavy clay or very sandy? This method actually works in both situations, though you might need to modify your approach slightly. In heavy clay, make sure you're adding plenty of compost to improve drainage. Clay soil that stays too wet will rot your potatoes. I usually add extra coarse sand or perlite to the mix for clay soils. In sandy soil, the challenge is moisture retention. Add lots of compost and consider using a mulch layer on top to help keep moisture in. I've seen this method succeed in all kinds of soil types. It just requires some adjustment based on your specific conditions. Another thing worth mentioning is that while this method is fantastic for growing giant potatoes, it's also just really good for growing potatoes in general, even if you don't hit those 2 kilogram marks. You'll consistently get larger, more uniform potatoes than with traditional methods. The deep planting, regular feeding, and hilling up all contribute to healthier plants and better tubers. So even if your biggest potato is 0.5 kilogram rather than 2 kilograms, that's still excellent and well above average. I also want to emphasize that gardening is always an experiment, even with proven methods like this one. Your climate, soil, weather patterns, and specific varieties will all affect your results. Don't get discouraged if your first attempt doesn't produce the absolute biggest potatoes you've ever seen. Pay attention to what works and what doesn't, and adjust for the next season. Every year I learn something new about growing potatoes, and that continuous learning is part of what makes gardening so rewarding. Keep notes if you can, just simple observations about when you planted, what varieties, how much you watered, when you fertilized, and what your harvest was like. Over time, you'll develop a sense for what works best in your specific situation. One last tip that I think makes a real difference. Talk to your plants. I'm only half joking here. Spending time in your garden, really observing your plants, touching the leaves, checking the soil, all of that attentiveness leads to better results. You notice problems earlier, you get a feel for when they need water or nutrients, you see pest issues before they become infestations. The gardeners I know who have the best results are the ones who are out there regularly, not just doing tasks but actually connecting with their plants and their garden. It sounds a bit mystical, but there's real practical value in that kind of attention. So there you have it, my complete method for growing absolutely giant potatoes right in your own garden. It takes some work, some planning, and some patience, but the payoff is incredible. There's something deeply satisfying about growing food, and when you can grow exceptional food that rivals or exceeds what you'd find at fancy farmers markets or specialty stores, that satisfaction multiplies. Every time I bake one of these giant potatoes, crispy on the outside and fluffy on the inside, I'm reminded why I love gardening so much. It's not just about the food, though that's a big part of it. It's about the process, the learning, the connection to the earth, and the simple joy of nurturing something from a small seed potato into something magnificent. I hope this guide inspires you to give this method a try. Start small if you need to. Maybe dedicate one bed or one trench to experimenting with this technique. I think you'll be amazed at the results. And once you pull your first giant potato out of the ground, you'll be hooked just like Daisy, Oliver, Rose, Ivy, Lucas, and countless others who've tried this approach. Remember, gardening is a journey, not a destination, and every season brings new opportunities to learn, grow, and improve. Here's to your biggest potato harvest yet. Happy gardening, everyone, and I'll see you in the next video where we'll explore more ways to make your garden thrive.